Welcome to Normal Islands Live with me, Curtis Daly. Thank you all for tuning in. And tonight I'm joined by a friend of the show, the wonderful, amazing Kevin Logan. Kevin, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, sir, and all the better for being in your presence.
You're such kind words. Every single time he exchanges such beautiful words, and it just makes my heart feel warm inside. Now, tonight, we will be covering the Conservative Party conference. Kemi Badenoch saying that 10% of the civil service should be jailed. Tom Tugendhat calls Labour socialist and calls for a Thatcher-style revolution. Robert Jenrick said the Star of David should be displayed at every point of entry to the UK. And despite being tonight the Conservative Party conference special, this story was too big to ignore. Escalation has ramped up in the Middle East after Iran sent rockets toward Israel. Remember, please make sure you leave a comment. We will be reading some of them out. And if you want yours read, then make sure you let us know your thoughts. Right, on to the first story. Kemi Badenoch says that 10% of the civil service should be jailed. Up to 10% of civil servants should be in prison for leaking official secrets and undermining ministers, Kemi Badenoch has said. The leadership candidate said not all civil servants were an issue, and many were like everyone else, with about 10% being absolutely magnificent. But she said there's about 5 to 10% of them who are very, very bad, should be in prison bad, leaking official secrets, undermining their ministers, agitating. I had some of it in my department. She said there was a problem with ministers using their powers too often. She said the trick to being a good minister is to find the good ones quickly, bring them close and try and get the bad ones out of your department as quickly as possible. A source close to Badenoch said she was joking when she made the comments, but it is the latest eyebrow-raising intervention she's made during the Conservative Party conference. Now, it's not clear what specific secrets she's referring to. Now, if it's state secrets, yes, that could undermine security, then obviously that's a big deal. However, she could also be referring to leaking information about corruption. Surely it's the duty of those in government and civil servants to make sure journalists have information on ministers if they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. Now, the next thing she says is very telling. I had some of it in my department, usually union-led, but most of them actually want to do a good job, and the good ones are very frustrated by the bad ones. Now, to me, that just sounds like she wants basically complete loyal civil servants, and those who are disloyal should be in prison. Now, she didn't directly say that, but when you piece it all together, there's an insinuation there. Kevin, you're more than welcome to correct me if you think I'm being over the top, but I can see parallels between this and Trump, the GOP Project 2025, where part of the plan is to rid bureaucrats, which is euphemism for dissenters, and they want to fill the government, legal departments, pretty much the entire state apparatus with loyalists. Do you agree with that? Maybe not on such a big scale, but it's the same idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the same idea. I think it's a very Project 2025 concept. It's essentially fascism. It's fascism trying to cloak itself as regard for the law, which is, of course, what fascism always tries to do. It essentially hides within the cloak of freedom of speech and democracy and the rule of law in order to destroy and undermine all of those things. What she's essentially talking about, especially when she says things like union-led, she wants to purge leftists, any kind of remotely leftist person from authority. And we've seen that as well from other people at the Tory party conference who talked about purging universities of but essentially enemies of the Conservative Party. And of course, this goes beyond just the potential sort of government overreach of trying to protect legitimate national state secrets, as you mentioned, and goes into the fact that it's obviously trying to curtail and put a freeze on any kind of whistleblowing about corruption, which of course was rampant in the Conservative Party. And that's what this is. It's score settling. It's petty, bureaucratic, fascistic score settling with leftists, an attempt to purge people of a different political persuasion, which is essentially the first thing that fascists always try and do. They'll either go after the arts, or in this case, I suppose, academia, or they'll go after the civil service, positions of power.
Yeah, and in one of her recent interviews, she said how careful she is with her words, and she never says anything she regrets. But following that, she came out with the most crazy things. I mean, she said that maternity pay was too high,
Yep.
and that women and families should rely on more on their personal responsibility rather than having, I don't know, rights for workers. She said that working in McDonald's suddenly made her working class, and now we have people around Badenoch saying, "Oh, don't worry, she was joking about the civil service comments." I mean,
Well,
Badenoch, far from being careful, I mean, she seems like a complete liability. I mean, but
she is.
she is what second favourite becoming Tory leader.
Yeah, she's currently second favourite, and realistically, I think the bookmakers have Jenrick as first and her as a close second, and those are the two. Albeit that Cleverly seems to have done well with his speech, but I mean, there were 5 weeks to go. Who knows? But yeah, she's a loose cannon. The idea that she chooses her words carefully, God only knows what she'd do if she let her lips fly a little bit. It's ridiculous, right? She, in addition to all of the gaffes you just mentioned, she also said that the minimum wage was too high and was hurting businesses. So, look, literally just coming out with the worst ideas that no one agrees with. She wants to turbocharge neoliberalism, which is exactly the problem that got Liz Truss into so much danger. And of course, Liz Truss reared her ugly head again at the conference, going on about how she would have done so much better than Rishi Sunak at the general election. Except, of course, she was kicked out before she even got to that point. So clearly not. Clearly and obviously not.
I mean, this feels like a reversal of the Labour leadership competition, because you had Keir Starmer pretending to be a lefty to get elected as leader, then pivots to the centre right. These guys, all right, you know they believe this sort of stuff when they say the minimum wage is too high because they're pro-business, right?
Yeah.
They don't like these sorts of things. So it's the opposite of Starmer, but in the way it's probably similar because, I mean, look, even though we know they believe these things, you would think, why are they talking about it openly? They don't exactly sound like popular things to say, especially on maternity pay, an insane thing to say. Do you think they're just courting the membership? And if they were to become leader, pivot to the so-called centre? When I say pivot, though, not like Keir Starmer actually pivoting in his policy, but pretending to pivot to be more moderate. Do you think that's in play? Or actually, are they like, do you know what? We're not doing this sort of playing by the same rules anymore. We're trying to get reform voters. We're going to be radical, and we're going to keep it even up to a general election.
Well, they're not even courting Conservative voters yet, because, of course, there's another round of eliminations via MPs until they get down to the final 2. So essentially, it looks like it's going to be Robert Jenrick and probably Kemi Badenoch, which are literally the 2 worst options from the Conservatives' own long-term standing. It's the worst they could possibly do. I desperately hope that they elect Kemi Badenoch, because she's a lunatic who will destroy the Conservative Party, which I think in the long run is a lot better for the country. She is, of course, an horrific transphobe and culture warrior of all kinds. She does genuinely believe the appalling idea she's putting forward. And of course, in her speech today, she said that she wanted a root and branch reform of every single aspect of what the British state does, which is essentially code for I want to privatise the NHS. That's what we all know that to be. So she's a true believer in that sense. But she won't have any chance to enact those policies because she'll have destroyed the Conservative Party. In trying to chase the reform vote, they essentially disregard 75% of the country and make themselves completely unelectable. Yeah. So if they want to destroy themselves, elect Jenrick or Badenoch, and it looks like they're going to.
The problem I have with this argument is that many people say, I want the Tories to elect the most radical leader. They will lose. And yes, in terms of electability, I completely agree. Badenoch, well, anyone in the leadership race isn't going to win an election. Yeah. I mean, I think that's largely out of their hands. What worries me, though, is legitimizing these sorts of arguments. For me, the way I see the map of politics right now is Labour's going to win the next election with or without Keir Starmer, possibly. I mean, let's throw that in there. But the debate is what worries me. Now, for me, I would want to see a more quote-unquote moderate Tory leader, because at least in terms of the debate, they won't be talking about, I don't know, Badenoch didn't say scrapping maternity pay, but she alluded to there was an issue with it, and the minimum wage. And I feel like, given that Labour are very happy to parrot right-wing myths and lies, they're more likely to fall into that trap. So what worries me is Kemi Badenoch becoming leader, and she just pulls Labour to the right. Whereas if there was a more centrist Tory leader, even though they're not going to win, it might give more space for Labour not to go down the right-wing pipeline because they already have anyway.
Well,
That's my argument.
Firstly, they already have, and I don't see that changing fundamentally anytime soon. And secondly, there is no non-extreme example. What I'm talking about is not choosing the most extreme, but choosing the most obviously crazy, the one that the public can see through. James Cleverly is quite a good salesman of the same crazy bullshit. Tom Tugendhat is a less effective, but still seemingly nice guy who can sell those arguments. They all believe fundamentally in the same precepts, right? They all want to get rid of remove us from the ECHR. They all believe that immigration needs to be vastly curtailed and that we need to set up Rwanda plus. They all fundamentally believe in one-upping themselves on who can deep throat Israel the most, which has been a fantastic, just cavalcade of madness, including the story I think we'll talk about later with Bobby J. So they all fundamentally believe the same nonsense, be it social, economic, or foreign policy. It's just that some of them are able to sell it in a more sane fashion and might be more electable, whereas Kemi Badenoch and Bobby Jenrick aren't either of those things. They're just crazy bastards who can't really control it or hide it, and I think the public will see through that.
Well, we're going to get to the comments a bit later on, but leave a comment. Who do you think is who do you side with? Me, where I say I think it's better to have a more moderate leader, or do you think Kevin's right that actually, I mean, even though we largely agree, but I want to see what people think about that.
If you're wrong and you agree with my fine co-host here, tell me who the moderate candidate is exactly.
And by the way, when I say moderate, I'm doing this. You can't see it on screen because there is, and that's something me and you definitely agree on. There is no moderate Tory candidate.
Yeah, they're not.
So I want to make sure I'm cut off screen if I'm doing that. But anyway, make sure you drop any comments in there. We are going to read them out, so keep them coming. And we are going to move on to our second story. Now, you mentioned Tom Tugendhat. He calls for the Thatcher-style revolution. During his final conference speech, Tom Tugendhat said, real growth, not the illusion of growth, that has been boosted by migration, has barely shifted in the past 30 years. Now that's left us poorer and more vulnerable. We need to free the economy. We need a new conservative revolution. That's what Margaret Thatcher did. That's what we need to do again, and we can do it. Tugendhat also blasted the Labour Party, seemingly calling them socialist. He attacked Labour and socialism as a whole. He said, we're building on the strong foundations of the past, and I'm standing because I believe in Britain. I have fought for Britain, and I've had enough of those who want to manage decline. That's what socialism delivers. It's not who I am, it's not who you are, and it's nothing more too fatal to a mission that losing faith in the future, nothing is more fatal to success than setting our ambitions so low that we don't even try. And nothing is more fatal to a nation than giving up on our belief in it. That's why we must win. Not in 10 years, not in 15, but in 5. We can't afford Labour. The country can't afford socialism. We can't afford to wait. And I will not wait. It's time to seize the moment and turn this around. Labour are socialists. It's not the first time someone has said that. Kevin, I want to get your response here. Despite the fact that we are still living in neoliberalism, nothing has fundamentally changed from Thatcherism. Why is Tugendhat calling for a Thatcherite revolution?
Because it's the only thing they know. They've essentially become a kind of Thatcherite religious cult. And they have the same reaction that all religious cults do. When things don't work, do more of the same thing because it's what the dear leader wanted or the dear leader asked for or demanded or whatever. They know one thing, and it's just more neoliberalism. Even though we saw with Liz Truss neoliberalism taken to its nth degree and how disastrous that is immediately, because even the uber capitalists know what an absolute disgrace it is and how obviously destructive that those kind of policies are. And it's not him alone who's making this kind of, frankly, batshit argument. Kemi Badenoch claimed that all of the Tory governments essentially were continuations of the Labour government, which I would agree with if she meant that they were all continuations, furtherances of Margaret Thatcher's government. But she means the previous Labour government were left-wing and they continue to remain being left-wing, which is interesting considering she served 3 prime ministers who she thinks were left-wing, but who wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party. It's almost as if she's talking shite and just making
Mm.
things up, because anything to avoid the obvious conclusion that actually our policies are enormously destructive and unpopular. No one likes us and we have no chance of winning. So let's just double down.
I like that he says we don't want to continue this managed decline. Is he admitting then that for 14 years we have had a managed decline?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think he was. I think that's what happens when you don't actually have a real analysis. You just say all sorts of shit and it trips you up. But I do want you to respond to his comment about immigration providing fake growth. I mean, growth is growth, you know, whether it comes from migration or not. He doesn't sound particularly economically literate. I mean, what does he mean by the illusion of growth? And also, how would his Thatcherite revolution bring growth? How is it any different to what Liz Truss talked about or Rachel Reeves by growing the economy seemingly without state investment? We know that with Liz Truss, there was a state investment-led growth program under Rachel Reeves, which was the Green Prosperity Plan. But as we know, that got watered down, so they're just pushing neoliberalism again.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, he's essentially trying to dog whistle racism to the Conservative base and indeed to other members of the Conservative parliamentary party, so that he can become a leader. Right now, he has no realistic chance, but he's fighting the good fight, so to speak. And so he's dog whistling racism in a way that's within the confines of his like economic one nation conservative bullshit. He's trying to be the heir to Thatcher, right? So that's what he's trying to do. But the actual crux of his argument, there is a kernel of truth to, but in nowhere near the way he means. When he says it brings fake growth, in essence, it kind of does, because you're not creating growth, you're bringing in other people's growth. Rather than those people being in, the places they're originally from, building up the economic base there and being productive and creative and wonderful there, they're coming to us. So essentially, we're continuing to extract resources from the global south, right? And of course, it's something of a kind of a bubble that waits to burst, because we know that the older cohort is getting larger and larger each generation. And therefore, you have a smaller and smaller tax base funding a larger and larger non-economically productive anymore class within society.
I mean, would you say he's right then? Would you say he's right for the wrong reasons? He's kind of right.
He's kind of right for entirely the wrong reasons, because, like you say, he doesn't have any kind of materialist analysis of this. He means it in some weird racist, like, oh, brown people coming in, they're just going to import the third world. All this rubbish or all this racist shite. What I'm referring to is the fact that you can't just have an increasing amount of people coming in to create a larger and larger cohort each generation, because that's just exponential growth, which is unsustainable. Essentially, you have to balance out your own birth rate. I know that sounds like a weird Nazi talking point, but essentially, in order to sort of curtail the problem, you have to actually create your own people in the place. And you have to get the economic system in place where you don't need a larger and larger and larger group of people funding this system. You actually tax properly so that you can have that relatively smaller tax base that then takes care of the system entirely, because you're actually taxing the people that have the money to be able to pay for the system. We're not a poor country. We create enormous amounts of wealth. At the same time that everyone's wealth has been massively decreasing, the number of billionaires in this country has quadrupled. That is where your wealth has gone. That's where the taxable wealth that could pay for things like getting rid of the rack problem in schools, building HS2, funding the green projects that we need for the future energy supply. All of these things could be taken care of in a way that the Tories would never ever allow for. So when I say he's right, I mean he's incidentally hit upon a point whilst being a racist prick that has some kernel of sort of truth to it in a way he could never possibly understand. You are muted at my end.
That's again me, muted again. That's the second time that's happened actually in a row. We're professionals here. There is a discussion to be had when it comes to levels of immigration and our economic system. Now, I find it quite ironic that conservatives who push the low regulation, global capitalists economic system then moan about high levels of migrants, when that comes with this system, isn't it? Now, for us leftists, we don't talk about capping migration because we don't think it's a problem. But in a way, it's like, why don't the conservatives or right-leaning people adopt left-wing economic policies, some of it, because then actually, if you invested in your own country, if you invested in jobs, invested in nursing and doctors, you wouldn't have to rely on importing
Absolutely, yeah.
labour. It's very funny. There's a disconnect there. And I feel like, to me, that means none of these people are actually serious about reducing immigration, because
No, they're
if
not.
you say to them, if you want to reduce immigration, but I don't think we should, but if you want to, you have to fundamentally change your economic system. We have to do away with neoliberalism. And they go, oh, well, don't really like that. I quite like this form of capitalism.
Well,
and they keep immigration as a salient issue in order to win elections on.
Well, exactly, yeah. If they wanted to tackle immigration, they could have done so at any point in the last 14 years. But instead, we've seen numbers massively increase. I remember as a younger man hearing about mass migration under Tony Blair. And the numbers that he was allowing into the country have been dwarfed by the Conservative governments of the last 14 years. So if they were serious about tackling immigration, they could have done so. In fact, they've been, frankly, in terms of numbers coming in, the most liberal of any government that's ever been in Britain, right? We've seen massive numbers of people coming in, which can be absolutely dealt with if you invest in the infrastructure, because we've already got housing shortages. And if you add more people to that, obviously that becomes a problem. Obviously, there's strain on the NHS, etc., which can be gotten around by taxing rich people and spending on the infrastructure, right? So there's that, right? Like you say, if you invest in your own country, it becomes less of an issue. And secondly, on a kind of global scale, about, like I say, taking wealth essentially in human capital from the global south, if they are indeed set on a kind of bigger, longer scale solution to the problem, stop economically destroying places and stop literally physically destroying places by bombing them, because people don't generally tend to want to get up and move 4,000 miles away on foot. They leave because the place they're in has been destroyed, either economically or physically with Western bombs, or in many cases, both. That's why they're leaving. If they're from that place, they'll stay in that place. Most people do. Roughly speaking, within 100 miles of where you're born is probably where you're going to die. And that's fine. People are the way they are. And so don't fund and adore and absolutely praise systems that are going to create the very people, migrants, that you don't want to be here. Whether they want that to be the case because they're racist or not, if you actually don't want those people to leave those places, stop fucking destroying those places.
Also, they should take climate seriously, because if they don't want millions of climate refugees, then they would tackle the climate emergency.
Yeah, we know this.
Was it Tugendhat?
A third of humanity.
Like climate emergency?
Oh, they're all idiots. I think I made a note here. Kemi Badenoch compared environmentalism to communism. She said it was rebranded communism. She's a fucking idiot. So they're all in that kind of way. Yeah, a third of humanity lives within 100 miles of the coast. Those people aren't just going to keep moving inland and inland onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. They're going to move to other places. The people of Polynesia don't disappear overnight. Their islands do. They remain, and they're going to go places. Some of the places will be here. And they don't like that. The Tories don't like that, apparently. And yet they are more than happy to, personally go and punch a polar bear to death to prove how against environmentalism they are. They want to lock up, just up oil protesters for doing nothing for 1 million years to show how absolutely authoritarian they are. As well as, of course, destroying the ozone layer and taking private jets down the pub, frankly, if they could. It's ridiculous. And ultimately, they sort of don't care because, again, as you kind of pointed out earlier, it's surface level. They have the most scant reading of the situation, to the point where they believe like Facebook boomer memes because they seem vaguely plausible, and they're based on nothing.
Precisely. Now, before we go on to our next story, I just want to say that if you like what we do, you can subscribe and share our content. Get the name out there. Okay, we're not big enough yet. I want people knowing who Turn Left are. So if you're watching now, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm. Share it. We're also on Twitter streaming, so retweet this. Tweet this to your lefty mates. Tweet this to your right-wing mates. If you've got any, let's get a name out there. If you want to see us grow, then that does require money. So you can support us if you go to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There you can support us monthly or give us any one-off donation. We're approaching 15k subs. We're about 50 away. But our long-term goal is for us to become full-time, and it means we can produce more content. So let's grow a socialist media alternative to take on the establishment commentariat, and you can be part of the journey. I want to go to some of your comments now. Make sure you keep them in throughout the show, but let's bring the first one up. Zeke, da beast. Good to see you again. Waiting song is dope, better than elevator music. It slaps, doesn't it? It slaps. That's why I don't mind waiting 10 minutes, because it's a good tune. Double D, Trump proves people like Kemi have a sizable market for their unhinged ravings. I mean, they certainly do in the US. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a bigger market over here. Doesn't mean it can't. I mean, there's arguments we thought this country would not be having, but we've decided to import culture war debates anyway. So I certainly think that number could grow, but I don't think it's as prevalent here than it is in the US. I'm not even going to try and pronounce your name. I'm just going to say we jock. Curtis looking blinged up tonight. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We jock Poopong McPlop is one of the greatest characters in comedy history, and you will put some respect on that goddamn name.
Bring up the old comment again. Go on, bring it up again. I wanna pronounce it. We jock Poop Pong MC Plop.
McPlop. He's Scottish. McPlop. Come on now. It's a Blackadder reference. Never mind, I've interrupted you. Go for it.
It's a little bit before my time, I think.
Before my time as well. I'm not that old. Jesus. Go on. Sorry.
I've obviously heard of Blackadder, but it's not something I particularly watch. Edward Sexby, good to see you again. The minimum wage is actually a legally mandated starvation level wage, along with tax credits and in-work benefits. It is, in effect, a huge state subsidy of employers' collective bargaining instead. I disagree. I mean, we need to have a minimum wage to make sure that there is at least a bottom level to pay people, because if there was no minimum wage, most employees would pay less than that. It's just that the minimum wage needs to be a living wage. Where I do agree is state benefits going to employers. Of course, tax credits, universal credit, housing benefit. Given the fact that people aren't earning enough, we are subsidizing landlords, for example. It's why universal basic income, a popular idea on the left and the right, by the way, something I'm very skeptical of, because it's the state propping up profits for companies. But again, that just means we need higher wages. Of course, collective bargaining is one, but I think a higher minimum wage is also another. James Holmes, been a member for 8 months. Thank you. I've seen your name pop up a few times. I really appreciate your support. Katie Marshall, see you there again, becoming a YouTube member. Thank you so much. Jim Speak, also good to see you again. Jenrick should get the Star of David tattoo above his port of entrance. How do we know he doesn't already? Just saying. And that is it for all our comments. So we will move on. And speaking of Jenrick, we're talking about him now. So Robert Jenrick, he is the current frontrunner to become the new Tory leader. He said something incredibly bizarre. He thinks it's a good idea for the Star of David to be displayed at every point of entry in the UK. The Tory leadership frontrunner told a Conservative Friends of Israel event he wanted Britain to be the most welcoming country in the world for Israelis and the Jewish community. He said that while Immigration Minister, he had pushed for Israelis travelling to Britain to be able to use e-gates. He said this would mean that at every airport and point of entry to our great country, there was a Star of David as a symbol that we support Israel. Now, might I say, we don't all support Israel. But moral arguments aside, this is just really weird. I mean, why would we want to show some allegiance to another state? This is the United Kingdom, not Israel. Kevin, the Star of David welcoming people to the country. What do you make of that?
I'm a little bit confused. Does Bobby Jenrick, is he under the impression that he's trying to become the leader of Israel or the leader of the United Kingdom? Because he seems to be under some sort of illusion that he's running for the Knesset or something. I'm not sure. Yeah, very, very odd. And again, like I say, they were falling over themselves to be more pro-Israel than the other candidates. It was frankly, genuinely embarrassing. He was stood at a Conservative Friends of Israel gathering at the Conservative conference in my own hometown of Birmingham. Yay. In a hoodie that said Hamas are terrorists. I mean, hot take. Mm-hmm. And then said that there needs to be Star of David at every entry port to the country, which is just weird. Like, would that make Jewish people feel more welcome? Because I think they'd just be a little bit freaked out by that, wouldn't they? I don't know any Jewish people who would want that to be the case. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily care that much, but I think a lot of them would be genuinely freaked out. And of course, when he says we stand with Israel, and this goes for the rather disgusting conservative prime minister that we currently have, when he said the same thing. And by the way, he's gone back to referring to Israel as she again. I don't know why you need gendered pronouns for a nation state, but there we go. Who is the we to which they refer there? Because it's not the British people. The British people, when polled by YouGov, found that only 17% of them viewed Israel positively, whereas nearly 7 in 10 viewed them negatively, massively polarized since October the 7th. There was a lot of goodwill immediately after October 7th, which Israel then destroyed by destroying the West Bank, by destroying Gaza and parts of the West Bank, and now destroying Lebanon. And presumably going to attack Iran as well now, I imagine. They don't speak for the British people. They have something completely at odds with the British people, their opinion. And this goes back to the Jam Man again, I think. You can tell why they took so much time and effort to get rid of him. Because they couldn't have the hegemony of the Westminster bubble and its opinion about foreign affairs challenged in any way whatsoever. He was a genuine threat to the status quo. So they had to get rid of him. And frankly, if they hadn't been able to get rid of him that way, I think they might have gone to more drastic measures in the end, in all honesty. If he'd become prime minister, I don't think he'd have lived out a first term. That's how seriously I think they would have taken it. And now they love it. They love that he will go out there and just parrot the same bullshit. As bombs fall on major settlements full of people, we're supposed to sit here and cry salt tears for Israel getting a tiny sliver of what it gives out daily to the people of Palestine and now Lebanon. No, it's ridiculous. These people don't represent the British people. They don't represent the British people's views. I don't stand with Israel. Fuck Israel.
I find it quite interesting when well, I mean, you brought up Jeremy Corbyn. Let's talk about him for a second. When he tried to bring the Labour Party back to where it's supposed to be with its centre-left policies. I don't want to hear anyone call it hard left. I challenge you every single time. I don't think ending austerity investment is hard left. He was told by those inside and outside the party in the media, well, you have to appeal to the electorate. You can't be too left-wing, okay? That's very funny. Now, juxtapose that with Robert Jenrick saying, we're incredibly pro-Israel. We stand with Israel. And as you pointed out, 17% of the voters support Israel. Basically, Israel isn't popular. Why isn't anyone saying to him, hold on a second, do you not need to meet where people are at? Because most people don't support what Israel's doing. Funny when it comes to that, isn't it? It's only leveled when you use left-wing economic policy or actually foreign policy that's about justice and peace. Suddenly you have to moderate your language, you have to be a bit more centrist or moderate about it, but you can say extreme things like we should put a religious faith, one religious faith, not all of them, but one image of Judaism, the Star of David, on all entry ports to make Israelis and Jewish people feel safe. But okay, then why don't we put display the Quran everywhere and say, look, many Muslim majority countries are being bombed with our help. Let's say to them, we care about you, we're welcoming them, and try and pitch that to anyone in the Tory party. They'd lose their mind.
The Tory party are filled with the kind of latent racism that thinks that just mosques existing in Britain is a sign that the Muslimics have taken over. And yet, for some reason, the idea of absolutely cucking ourselves out to a foreign nation under the guise of religious toleration of Jewish people, which, by the way, they don't obviously give a fuck about at all, is madness that they would ever be okay with that. Like, if Muslims just existing is them taking over, what the hell would this thing be exactly? Like, who are they trying to govern in the interests of? Because it's not the British people, and it's not British Jewish people either. Israel is essentially a Western outpost. It is an American away ground, for so to speak, right? It's their thing that they're there to do our bidding in a region full of people who don't want us to do the bidding, and that's all that this is. They don't give a fuck about Jewish people either in Israel or outside of Israel. And indeed, frankly, neither did the Israeli government. We've seen the way they've treated Orthodox Jewish people who have campaigned against the current ongoing wars.
Precisely.
They couldn't give two fucks about Jewish people. They care about Zionism. And those two things are very different and, frankly, are enemies of one another.
I agree. We are going to move on to our last story, but it's all quite connected, actually. Now, as I said at the beginning of the show, despite tonight being the Conservative Party conference special, we had news last night which saw an escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, meaning that we simply couldn't ignore this story. So, last night, Iran fired around 200 missiles into Israel. So far, there doesn't seem to be any deaths reported. Iran has launched a barrage of missiles at Israel in an attack Benjamin Netanyahu labelled a major mistake. As he said, it will pay. In a move anticipated by officials, nearly 200 missiles were launched on Tuesday evening, according to Israel's army radio. The attack, in retaliation for Israel's campaign against the Hezbollah group in Lebanon, marks a significant escalation in the Middle East conflict. Now, that is a quote. Obviously, I disagree with the way that quote is framed. Now, this has received widespread condemnation across the West. Prime Minister Keir Starmer gave his statement.
Good evening. In the last few hours, the Iranian regime has launched over 200 ballistic missiles at civilian targets in Israel. It's too soon to assess the impact fully, but I utterly condemn this attempt by the Iranian regime to harm innocent Israelis, to escalate this incredibly dangerous situation and push the region ever closer to the brink. It cannot be tolerated. We stand with Israel and we recognise her right to self-defence in the face of this aggression. Iran must stop these attacks, together with its proxies like Hezbollah. Iran has menaced the Middle East for far too long. Chaos and destruction brought not just to Israel, but to the people they live amongst in Lebanon and beyond.
Now, I just want to quickly offer a correction. My producers just said that there was one death, a Palestinian in the West Bank. They were hit by a shrapnel. But looking at that video there, I mean, Keir Starmer is blaming the escalation on Iran, saying he stands by Israel in the face of aggression. It is, as Kevin pointed out earlier, it's so strange that he keeps referring to Israel as her. I think it's pretty creepy, actually. Now, following the same rhetoric, Robert Jenrick tweeted this. Tonight we have seen a terrible and unprovoked attack against Israel by Iran, the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. There can be no more appeasement. We must stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, our ally, just as we have with Ukraine. All the support necessary to win this war must be given to Israel so they can defeat the evil Iranian regime. That was Robert Jenrick saying the attack by Iran was unprovoked. I mean, that's quite astonishing. I mean, he and everyone else are ignoring the facts that Israel attacked Iran in April, in which no one in the West called out. Iran then responded because they have a right to defend themselves, in which it received wide condemnation. Along with that, you've got the occupation in Palestine. Israel's committed multiple terror attacks in Lebanon, plus a ground invasion. But Jenrick tweets out that Israel was the victim of an unprovoked attack. Now, Israel has vowed that they will retaliate big. Mr. Netanyahu said there is a deliberate and murderous hand behind this attack. It comes from Tehran, he continued. We will stand by the rule we established. Whoever attacks us, we will attack him. His comments came after IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari labelled the attack extensive and said there will be repercussions. We have plans. Iran has already said it will respond to any retaliation. If that isn't enough, Netanyahu has also barred the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres from the country. Israel's foreign minister says UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is persona non grata in Israel and is barred from entering the country. Israel Katz says his decision is a response to Gutierrez's failure to unequivocally condemn Iran's missile attack on Israel on Tuesday. He accuses the UN chief of being anti-Israel and giving support to terrorists, rapists and murderers. Gutierrez will be remembered as a stain on the history of the UN for generations to come. Yesterday, the UN chief condemns the broadening of the Middle East conflict with escalation after escalation and called for a ceasefire. I don't think anyone can argue that Israel isn't a rogue state. Now, a few hours ago, we've confirmed that 3 people have been killed by Israel in a strike. 3 people have been killed in an Israeli strike on Damascus, Syrian state media reports. 3 civilians were killed and 3 others were wounded in an Israeli strike in the Mezar neighborhood of Damascus on Wednesday, Syrian state news agency Sana said, citing a military source. The strike targeted a residential building and caused damage to private properties nearby. Asked about reports of the strike, the Israeli military told CNN that it does not comment on foreign reports. Kevin, I mean, there are a lot of things to cover here. I'll start by the claim from Jenrick and insinuated from Starmer that this was unprovoked.
Unprovoked, totally unprovoked. Look, Israel is just a small bean. They're so helpless. They're surrounded by people who don't like them. I wonder why that might be the case. Jesus Christ. Like, they haven't been doing a genocide in the Gaza Strip for the last year. Well, in fact, actually, they've been doing it for 70 years, but, you know, more intensely so in the last year. As if they haven't been destroying diplomatic immunity by killing Iranian officials, by blowing up parts of their embassies. As if they haven't just launched a ground invasion against the foreign sovereign nation of Lebanon, as if they haven't been firing consistently on basically all of their neighbours. And by the way, with British complicity as well, because there have been planes taking off from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, a British airbase. So we are literally not just passively selling weapons to the Israelis, we are actively engaged in the genocide they've been undertaking. The idea that this is unprovoked is laughable to the point of, just disbelief. I don't know what to say to that. He can't possibly believe it. He must be lying, because he's not actually insane. He must just be lying. That's the only thing I can think here. And of course, flip the script, right? I've always said it for the last year now. Compare and contrast the way in which Western media and Western politicians talk about the Russian illegal aggression against Ukraine and Israel's illegal aggression against Palestine and indeed others. That's always an interesting juxtaposition. But you don't even have to go that far afield anymore. Just compare the same politicians and same media outlets' response to the way in which Israel has been bombing civilians and the way in which Israel is now having its civilians bombed. Because for the longest time, I was told that if you have your buildings in heavily densely populated areas, you're using human shields. Hamas was using human shields. Hezbollah is using human shields because they've got their offices in like a tower block or something. Whereas apparently Mossad, having their headquarters in the middle of Tel Aviv in a high, built up district, apparently that's not human shields. That's Iran wanting to kill innocent Jewish people. And of course, that juxtaposition tells you everything you need to know about this. The incredible levels of Western chauvinism, on top of the fact that there's just an enormous amount of racism. They don't mind killing brown people. If brown people are being murdered, they're absolutely fine with that. Whereas the Israelis are seen as white enough, basically. It's absolute madness. And they've discovered now, the Israelis all of a sudden, from out of nowhere, have discovered that actually shelling settlements is bad. Shelling the urban areas is a bad thing, that they've also been doing for the last 18 months and indeed decades before that. It's farcical. And I feel like I'm losing my mind when I see the media just going along this line. They've all been constantly ignoring and using passive voice to describe how Palestinians just kind of died. Whereas now it's Iran launches mega super Holocaust on Israel. Everyone feels sorry for Israel. It's honestly, genuinely.
And that's the thing. I mean, obviously I was corrected, but I said no one had died. And obviously there was a Palestinian that was killed by shrapnel. But no Israeli was killed from the strike. And they're acting, that was the worst strike we've ever seen. But when hundreds of people are killed on two, I call it terrorist attacks in Lebanon from Israel, or the up to hundreds of thousands of people, Palestinians, have been killed. That's different. Yeah. It's very funny how they do that. I find it incredibly ironic that Hagari is calling these strikes from Iran extensive. I mean, as I said, there's no reported deaths, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including children and babies, because Hamas killed around 700 in October. Now, there's a couple of figures there. People say it's 1,200. The latest figures I've looked into is around 700 to 800 just innocent people, and the rest of them are the IDF. He asked me, I don't give a rat's ass about the IDF. They're an occupying force. So whenever I look at the number, I say about 700. But given that within Israel, most people think Israel's response has either been proportionate or not hard enough, do you expect there to be a shift now? Since basically what Israel was doing, they're getting some retaliation. Or do you think this will actually rally the people even further? And rather than undermining Netanyahu, this will bolster him? I mean, clearly he can no longer claim this is all about keeping Israel safe when it objectively isn't.
Well, that will be the interesting thing. Generally speaking, as we've seen with Gaza, if you shell civilians, it does tend to get their backs up and they tend to resist more fervently. It tends to harden the hearts and minds of the people that live in those areas, right? And so I expect personally that Benjamin Netanyahu will use this and be able to continue and be prime minister and avoid the much-deserved jail sentence that he would get otherwise. And that's ultimately what this is. It's one man's desire to avoid the repercussions of his own and indeed his wife's corruption. To the tune of hundreds of thousands of lives. It's genuinely repulsive. So I think that's what will happen. But he is very unpopular. We have already seen a nationwide strike, albeit relatively ineffective, but large protests and large demonstrations against him. And this might spur those on again, especially if you get repeated rounds of this, because the Iron Dome was very ineffective. As much as not many people were killed or injured, when people see the illusion of protection that the Iron Dome was supposed to give them shattered, stripped away from them when 9 in 10 of these rockets were getting through. It was genuinely mad to think they've spent all this money, all the US taxpayers' money, on this Iron Dome system that clearly just doesn't work with modern rocketry. It isn't suitable for this kind of warfare at all. They may well turn on him. They may well ask that this, that this stops now, because they're the ones facing repercussions. And when it's always easy to be pro-war when you're not the one facing the consequences. All of a sudden, you get a little taste of those consequences, and a lot of pacifists emerge. So we'll wait and see, I suppose. But I hope it has the latter of those effects.
I mean, what I find quite interesting is I was referring to a poll, or multiple polls within Israeli society, that most of them support the scale of the attack on Palestine. Like I said, the two most favourable opinions are it's about right or not hard enough. But then you couple that with the fact that Netanyahu is very, very unpopular. So I want to kind of decipher what that unpopularity actually is. It can't be because they disagree with him on policy, because seemingly they don't.
Yeah.
But possibly they think, even though we think we should be extremely strong on Hamas and by extension Palestine, maybe they do see Netanyahu as a loose cannon, and maybe they think he's less safe. I wonder what you can probably decipher from this sort of gap between the popularity for the policy and not the popularity for the man.
Well, exactly. Yeah, the vast majority of people who oppose him are themselves Zionists, because obviously the vast majority of Israeli citizens, or let's say of Jewish Israeli citizens, are Zionists. And so, the vast majority of these people are hardline Zionists themselves, who think that actually he's hurting Zionism ultimately by being ineffective or going too far too soon type thing. And of course, his absolute lack of giving a shit about the actual hostages. Because whilst a lot of them use the bring home the hostages, or indeed sausages, as one prime minister referred to them delightfully, they use the phrase release the hostages or bring home the hostages as a kind of propaganda tool. A lot of people actually do genuinely want that. A lot of people think that should be the war goal, that they want those people back. And he has shown absolutely that he doesn't give a fuck about them. He has killed many of them, of course. The Israeli government have literally murdered their own people. And have not really tried. They could have had all of these people back if they'd agreed to any number of the deals along the route that Hamas and various other people have negotiated. He's not interested in any of that. And I think a lot of people see through him now. I think a lot of people realize that this is what he is. He's just a bloodthirsty, warmongering piece of shit who's doing it to cover his own ass. And they've had enough. So it's not that this is some sort of anti-Zionist uprising. This is a fracturing within Zionism based upon the personality of one genuinely evil motherfucker.
Yeah. I want to get your reaction to Starmer's statement. We talked about Jenrick and calling it unprovoked, which was crazy. But that, to me, was striking. That was pretty disgusting.
Barely a peep.
There was no sort of extra layer saying, look, we want peace in the region. We want to, we want Israel to restrain, but also we want Iran to stop attacking. Like, there was no appeal to diplomacy there. It was quite literally very similar to any Tory leadership contest member, anyone running in the Tory leadership. It seemed exactly the same. It was, we unequivocally stand with Israel. Iran is the bad guy of the area. It's a regime. It is a regime, right? I'm not standing Iran here. I'm simply adhering to international law. Iran has the right to defend themselves. It's not an endorsement of them. But the idea that Iran is the only bad guy in the Middle East, to me, one screams of favoritism, obviously because of Israel, and also racism. But I thought that was an incredibly disgusting statement. So I want to get your thoughts on Starmer's statement.
It was genuinely disgusting. Barely a peep out of him in sympathy for the hundreds of thousands destroyed, the entire cities razed to the ground in Gaza, and indeed various other parts of the Middle East by Israeli actions over the years. And then as the second they get even, like I say, a tiny little sliver of their own medicine, he's out there deep-throating the boot in extraordinarily pathetic, cucked fashion. And again, referring to them as her or she. I think it goes beyond just being creepy and weird. I think there is actually a kind of paternalistic element within humanity that's being sort of turned into racism there. That it's to feminize Israel is to say, look what these evil barbaric people are doing. It's
careful language, isn't it?
It's essentially trying to make Israel seem like the weak prey that's being preyed on by these evil savages, these sand people. That's the sort of imagery that they're trying to conjure up. I think it's a very subtle and pernicious bit of Hasbro propaganda, basically. And the fact that he keeps doing this when he thinks he can get away with it is genuinely appalling, and shows that, whether he truly believes it or not, because he, of course, used to be sort of anti-Israel when it suited him, because the leader of the party was sort of anti-Israel as well in Jeremy Corbyn. But now that he can get away with it, maybe he's showing his true colours. Who knows with Keir Starmer? Who knows whether he truly believes anything? Whether he has a single political thought or theory or set of principles in his head or not. I think he would happily sell out Israel if America told them to, or whatever. If the zeitgeist changed.
If America says it, that's if you want to know Keir Starmer's allegiance, it's the USA. And I think why does he keep referring to Israel as her? Part of it is that sort of racial supremacy, as you alluded to. Yeah. But also, I think, and I've found this particularly with Keir Starmer, I've seen it for years. I think he's a huge sycophant. And I think he has this weird fetish or fetishization of appealing to power or groveling for power. Like the way he speaks, when he talks about how we've got all these businessmen coming into the party, these rich billionaires, the way he speaks is like they're his little master, and he's like, yes sir, yes sir. It's I've picked it up over the years, and it's a very strange thing. He loves showing the world how much of a cuck, how much of a bitch to capital he is. And I think that's the same when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to the US and Israel. I think he just desperately wants to show the world that he's a good little boy and he would do as he's told, which is what Washington tells them to do.
Yeah, exactly. Like I say, as I mentioned earlier, there's a reason they got rid of the previous Labour leader and were so desperate to do so,
Yeah.
because they need essentially a piece of putty that they can mold into whatever shape they need him to be.
Mm.
He can believe anything. He can argue any position, including positions completely diametric to the ones he held yesterday. It's very sort of Orwellian, I suppose, in that we were never at war with East Asia. We were always at war with Eurasia. And anyone who says differently is against the party or whatever. You know, it's that sort of thing. He will say whatever the powerful want him to say, basically. And again, I refer to him as different to the powerful because I don't think he ultimately is that powerful. I think he's at behest of people like the Labour Together folks, the Pat
precisely,
McFadden,
yeah,
and people like that. I think, frankly, the government is being run by two women in a very girl boss way, in Rachel Reeves as Chancellor and Sue Gray as, I don't know, de facto Queen or something. I'm not sure. So yeah, he's ultimately he's just he is a kind of cock. He's a pathetic toadying lackey who is quite happy about that in a way. Yeah, it's sort of sad.
Yeah, I agree. Starmer's not particularly powerful himself. He's obviously in a position of power. But the real people behind him, Rachel Reeves is one, Sue Gray, but also Morgan McSweeney and the Labour Together lot. Yep. Don't be surprised if Labour Together dispose of Keir Starmer and put in Streeting or Reeves. Yeah. The whole, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I went into the sort of obviously the anti-Semitism crisis, the one that's concocted by, it turns out, by Labour Together. They specifically looked for, as you described, a bit of putty. You mold him. He's a vacuum. He has no political principles. Maybe there was a time when he was younger and he was vaguely anti-Israel or pro-Palestine. He probably had some principles as a kid in uni, but now he's not. He listens to the ear of like I said, McSweeney. He's also pretty clueless. He's not much of a political operator, so he doesn't know any better.
Well, I honestly don't think.
Power.
Yeah, I don't think he was supposed to be prime minister. I think the plan was that he was going to be a kind of Kinnock figure, change the party into something vaguely centristy, centre right, and then Tony Blair would come along, either Streeting or whoever, to be the actual prime minister. But the Tories were so disastrous that the kind of schedule was way ahead of where they thought it was going to be, and so they're sort of stuck with this very unpopular carpet salesman.
Well, I mean, you can see it in their own language when the Labour right figures say, well, after the 2019 election, we could not believe we could turn it around, and it's gobsmacking that we've won an election. And that's kind of telling, because they're saying, we didn't expect to turn this around. We didn't instill Keir Starmer because we thought he's a particularly good leader and he has the right policies and he has the right instincts to turn the chances for Labour around. They were expecting for Starmer to lose. And you're absolutely right. Starmer was there to completely hollow out the party for anything vaguely left-wing, anything vaguely Corbynite. And then the future of Starmer doesn't really matter whether he were to win in 10 years or be someone else. He was obviously that bridge to change the party. But obviously they didn't expect the Conservatives to collapse so much. And that's where we are now.
Yeah, and I think there's very little chance he fights a second general election now. I think he's hold below the waterline. He's unpopular. And they've shown how ruthless they'll be.
Astonishingly unpopular. The decisions he's made, the things he's done, I'm gobsmacked. I didn't expect Starmer to be politically smart, make some good decisions, but I also didn't think he would be so risky in the bad things he's done. Not the good things, but the bad things.
Yeah, look, he's decided to burn all of his political capital on some of the dumbest stuff that will make no difference.
Yeah.
He's decided to die on the hill of, I want to freeze Granny. Who thinks that's a good thing? No, literally nobody thinks that's a good policy, and yet he's made himself phenomenally unpopular. And of course, he's a corrupt piece of shit and always has been, and that's been exposed now. That's nice. Bit late now, lads. I was ranting before we got going about how the journalist class in this country are so terrible. They didn't do any of this before the election when it actually mattered, when we could make a value judgment on this person's character. No, now he's prime minister. Now we'll expose the things that he's done.
Yep.
Oh, thanks. Now that there's nothing we can do about it. Absolutely.
The media's a good segue into the plug, because look, no one called out Starmer and Labour and their big billionaire backers. I mean, I know the £4 million from Quadrature that came from the Cayman Islands. That wasn't known by journalists because of the timing of it, which is obviously done on purpose, so it wasn't revealed before the election. But that wasn't the only donation we had. I mean, Labour were generated the most amount of donations from big time people. We had John Caldwell from Phones for You. He's one that always sticks in my mind. I think it was him who said that Labour are now the capitalist or venture capitalist party, commercial capitalist. They're a commercial capitalist party that I enjoy. No one said anything then. No one said, oh, look, all these former Tory donors, even Liz Truss supporters went to the Labour Party. No journalistic integrity. But obviously, after he's in, people in the media want to look like they're doing their job. And suddenly they start talking about Wahid Ali and his donations. But even still, when they call him out for it, they're not even talking about bribery or what it means. They just say, well, it's indulgent. You know, he's indulging himself in clothes. The biggest criticism you get, I mean, it's a good line, which is, look, he's scrapping the winter fuel payments whilst also taking freebies. It's a good hypocritical line to take, but that's not even deep enough. The truth is, people give money to political parties. People gave money to Keir Starmer because they want a return on investment. Yep. I think we've ranted on Keir Starmer for quite a while there, and we've gone a bit over, but that is all we have time for. I want to thank everyone who tuned in, everyone who commented. I really appreciate it. And of course, I want to thank Kevin Logan for once again being a great guest, friend of the show. He's very insightful. If you don't follow him, you must. He's on YouTube under the name @Ploppy111. Don't ask me, I don't know. Maybe we'll ask Kevin why you're under Ploppy111.
It's similar to We Jock Poo Pong McPlop. It's a Blackadder reference. I'm a very sensible adult.
Indeed you are. But you can also follow him on Twitch at KF Logan 1875. No, that's not when he was born. Remember, if you enjoyed this live show, if you enjoyed this live show, you can support Turn Left by hitting that subscribe button, hit that like button. We've got 184 concurrent viewers over Twitter and YouTube. Currently 61 people watching, so I want all of you to hit that like button. It helps the algorithm, it pushes us out. And if you like our work and you want us to become full-time, then you can support us by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. My name's Curtis Daly. Thank you, and see you next time.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn Left.